Welcome to another episode of Global Forum. This is a series focused on election 2008. Today we invited Peter Camejo to be our exclusive guest on this program. To talk with Peter, we must start the story in 1960s when he was a student at UC Berkeley and the free speech movement that started on this campus. He was one of the main leaders. He was actually elected to the student body but was removed after his election. He became so prominent in the 1960s that Governor Ronald Reagan called him one of the 10 most dangerous people in this country. In 1976, he ran for President of the United States as a third-party candidate. The candidate, Jimmy Carter, at that time in writing agreed to debate him, but then went back on his word. He did debate Ted Kennedy 3 times. He has been a presidential candidate, a vice presidential candidate, a gubernatorial candidate, a man who could have moved into any major party and one major acclaim for himself, preferred to remain with third party to be consistent with his principles and ideals. We are pleased and honored to have you today with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Peter, tell us about your name first of all and tell us about your origin. How did you get this name?
I'm a Venezuelan American, and by sort of accident I was named after a famous Venezuelan. It would be like being called Tom Jefferson in the United States. But what's interesting is that I'm named after an African Venezuelan who was the first general. He died in the Battle of Carabobo, and Simón Bolívar in the Battle for Independence made him a general. What's odd is the reason he had my name is because from a distant relative of mine, he was a slave of the Camejo family, of which I am. I come from a ruling class family in Venezuela, came to the United States, was born here. The reason I came to the United States was that my grandfather spoke out against the dictatorship in Venezuela, and he had to move to the United States. They kicked him out of Venezuela. And my mother grew up partially in the United States, and then I ended up most of my life, not all of it, living in the United States, not Venezuela.
Very good. Peter, tell us about your politics. You have spent, what, like 40 years in American mainstream politics now, making waves, creating consequences, fighting these major battles. What is the defining essence of this politics?
Well, I was clearly a product of the 60s, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in Vietnam, sort of determined, plus reading history and trying to understand. But what has been, to me, my understanding and my reason I have done what I've done, is that I think there's 2 Americas. There's been an America that's been fighting for freedom and liberty and respect in the world, and an America that is thought to dominate and control the world. And those who are for freedom have won occasionally. They won against the British, and they established some very important concepts, very democratic, very step forwards for humanity, like freedom of religion. Most countries before the American Revolution only had one religion allowed. In the United States, people of any faith could. In 1792, most Americans do not know this, the United States Senate voted unanimously, because they were dealing with Muslims, that they were not based on Christianity. The first 6 presidents of the United States were not Christians. This is part of the history of America that's been hidden. There's been another America that has been trying to use the power of America to dominate the world economically. It is the force that has today invaded Iraq. It is what has made. And it is very interesting how this is done in America. It's very different from any other country. It's one of the most interesting, misunderstood aspects of America is the 2-party system we have, which Ralph Nader calls the 2-party dictatorships. Usually there's a 1-party dictatorship, so it's very obvious that you know it's a dictatorship. In America, there's a very subtle process that makes the American people think they're making the decisions.
Peter, before we go to 2-party system,
sure.
I want to understand what has been the driving force behind your politics. What have been your guiding principles of politics so far?
Well, my development was sort of peculiar. Being born in a wealthy family, in a ruling class family, I became very much aware at a very young age of the injustice that exists in society. My father was a developer, and I remember playing soccer with the workers that worked for my father and seeing them as human beings. This made me completely hostile to what I saw. And at first I thought America was this wonderful place that didn't have poverty. I didn't see poverty where I lived. There was no poverty in Great Neck, New York. And I had an aunt who told me one day, I said, gosh, if America could only run Venezuela, things would be great. My aunt said, no, the problem is America does run Venezuela. And as I began to understand that, that the poverty we had in Venezuela, we're an oil-rich country. There was no need to have any poverty in Venezuela. It was imposed because the wealthy took everything, robbed the poor, and it radicalized me, and I became very interested and read, all points of view about world history and what's happened in the world. And I joined the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. I marched with Martin Luther King, and throughout my life I've worked defending the undocumented workers, the rights of women, and so forth.
Let me just state for the record that not only you have fought with all the people that you have mentioned, you have been standing with American Muslims from day one. In 1984, you had joined us under Pakistan American Democratic Freedom to help restore democracy in Pakistan. Then in the 1990s, you stood with us as a Muslim community. After Patriot Act, you have been one of the very few people who publicly supported Professor Samuel Aryan, the distinguished Palestinian who's in prison right now. So I just want to note that for record. Let's come back to the issue. So you bring a certain agenda of social justice to these things and peace. So if I understand you correctly, the two most important principles in your politics, Peter, have been peace and social justice.
Yes.
Now let's look at the notion of peace and social justice, and let's look at the present context. What's going on in Iraq right now in your judgment?
Well, in Iraq, it's a beautiful example of how the media in America completely falsifies the story. Saddam Hussein, the dictator in Iraq, was put there by the United States, supported by the United States, armed by the United States. They gave him poison gas. I've always said that when the Bush administration said, we know they have weapons of mass destruction, they could have made a very telling point by saying, we gave that to them. You know, this would be an argument that would be difficult to oppose because they gave them a mustard gas, they gave him all kinds of poison gas. When he used it, they then had secret meetings with him to tell him it was okay. When Iraq invaded Iran, they helped arm Iraq. They helped get $25 billion in loans, build up their army, and then the US military supported them. The American people are completely ignorant of all this history. The media very carefully hides it. Osama bin Laden, the United States gave $4 billion to him to build up his apparatus because they wanted to practice terrorism against the Russians. And it's not that I support the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in any way, shape, or form, but to use terrorism is always wrong. That is to kill innocent people, to make that kind of attacks that we see all over the world. But in my opinion, the largest terrorist organization in the world is the United States government and the CIA. They have committed more crimes of this kind than anyone, and including against me, because I was on my way to help a peasant candidate in Peru in 1979, and the CIA tried to have me arrested in Colombia, so I couldn't make it down there, and I, by miracle, escaped. I'm writing an autobiography, so that'll all be there. They did imprison my brother and torture him for 3 years. He was in prison.
Now, Peter, when we look at the situation in Iraq, will you say it is quite evident now that the elite consensus in America on 4 major issues has broken down? And that's the war in Iraq, that's the issue of immigration, that is denying people civil liberties and human rights under USA Patriot Act. And fourth and finally, and most surprisingly, even on the question of Palestine, the 100% elite consensus is no longer there. People have defected from that.
Yes, I think this has been one of the most successful propaganda campaigns. One beautiful example, which I'll mention in terms of the 2008 elections, is that the media is now telling the American people that the Democratic Party is opposed to the war. Now, what most Americans are never going to be told is that, well, they voted for everything George Bush asked them to vote for. But they voted for a motion that said unequivocal support for George Bush's conduct of the war. Now, that's something they want to forget, and they don't want to bring in the media. Right after the elections of 2004, where I ran for vice president, when Bush gave his State of the Union address, the Democrats gave him 39 standing ovations in 1 hour. Every time he used the word Iraq, before he finished his sentence, they were on their feet cheering them. Now they try to present them as though they're opposed to war, that they want to leave Iraq. The fact is, every major candidate of the Democratic Party is for permanent occupation of Iraq, including Obama, who is presented as this big anti-war person. He has said, we will leave troops in Iraq indefinitely. He has also said he would consider invading Iran, and he would definitely consider invading Pakistan.